Between the Covers is brought to you in part through the support of Propeller, a magazine of books, music, art, film, and life, and its publishing imprint, Propeller Books. Visit them on the web at propellermag.com and propellerbooks.com or on Twitter at propellermag.
Coming up next is my conversation with poet and visual artist Jen Bervin about one of the most unique and remarkable books, but also one of the most unique and remarkable careers of a living artist today. I'd been hoping to interview Jen for years now, and we'd been corresponding over that time, and something finally brought her to Portland for the interview, and I'm really excited to share it with you. But before we begin, I wanted to talk about another book that arose from this podcast. Many of you have listened to the 3 conversations with Ursula K. Le Guin, a conversation each in fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. At the end of our last conversation, I said to her, I can't imagine who else I could have done this with. 3 deep dives into each of the 3 genres. Who else had so many books in each and such a sustained engagement in each over time, I was thinking. And her immediate response was, why don't we make a book out of it? And that book came out a month ago now from Tin House Books, called Ursula K. Le Guin, Conversations on Writing. And yet, while it began with these 3 podcast conversations, it is a very different reading experience in a couple of regards. Ursula and I spent quite a bit of time choosing and interweaving excerpts so that when she talks about the rhythm of Virginia Woolf or Tolkien's prose, you get examples on the opposite page. When she talks about diagramming a sentence, we diagram one from George Orwell. And when she's discussing her own work, we chose and wove in her own poems, a translation of hers, excerpts from her essays and speeches. And in addition, we each wrote original material. I contextualized the circumstances of each of our 3 meetings and my understanding of Ursula's relationship to the specific genre that she's going to talk about. And she wrote this really insightful and also very funny introduction called Fear and Loathing in the Interview, where she looks at all the ways interviews can and have gone wrong for her and the types of conversations she particularly loved having. On top of it all, Tin House Books made it into a beautiful object to hold and behold, so I hope you'll check it out. And one more thing before we begin, we're also on the last box of Jesse Ball's fantastic, co-written, out-of-print, illustrated book, Vera and Linus, a book which Publishers Weekly said, the light touch and archaic feel of the prose owes as much to Kafka as to classic fairy tales. Certainly many readers will find this book unsettling, but most will also find it hard not to remember a time when the world was filled with this kind of fearful mystery and wonder. These are probably some of the last copies of the book around, as the book is not only out of print, but the Icelandic press that made them no longer exists either. So you can find out how to get a copy of that book, Vera and Linus, by going to patreon.com/betweenthecovers. There you'll also discover the bonus archive material from each guest as well. And if Jesse Ball's book doesn't tickle your fancy, I also have a small number of copies of the Ursula book that I could send in instead, as well as a couple copies of upcoming guest books, Sheila Hetty's new book, Motherhood, Molly Crabapple's new co-written illustrated book, Brothers of the Gun, about the Syrian War, and more. Enjoy today's program. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is the artist and poet Jen Bervin. Jen Bervin's work often involves a combination of text and textile, weaving together art, writing, science, and archival research into one of the most unique bodies of work in contemporary writing or visual art today.
She's the author of 10 books, books that include one of the canonical texts of erasure poetry, Nets, an engagement with Shakespeare's sonnets published by Ugly Duckling Press, and of which Paul Auster says, Jen Bervin's Nets has reimagined Shakespeare as our true contemporary. Her other books include The Gorgeous Nothings, Emily Dickinson's envelope poems, co-edited with Marta Werner, out from New Directions. The Gorgeous Nothings was named a Best Book of the Year by The New Yorker and the Times Literary Supplement, was a finalist for the Poetry Foundation's 2014 Pegasus Award for Criticism, and by foregrounding the visual art component of Dickinson's poetry, has played a crucial role in our ongoing reevaluation of Emily Dickinson's writing on its own terms. As Ben Lerner said in The New Yorker, this exquisitely produced book, lovingly curated by Bervin and Werner, allows you to encounter Emily Dickinson's envelope poems in full color facsimile for the first time. It's an experience suspended between reading and looking, of toggling between those two modes of perception, and it thoroughly refreshes both. Jen Bervin's large-scale art installations include River, a project 10 years in the making of a hand-sewn geocentric model of the Mississippi River in silver sequins, as well as the Dickinson Composite Series, a series of large-scale embroideries that, as an act of mending and restitution, depicts with cotton and silk thread the variant words and variant marks that we've come to realize are so vital to Dickinson's poetics, but which were regularly omitted along with her preferred line breaks in the reading editions of her poems. Jen Bervin's work has been exhibited nationally and internationally and is held in more than 30 collections, including those of Yale and Stanford universities, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and the J. Paul Getty Museum. Bervin is the recipient of many awards and honors, including an Asian Cultural Council Fellowship, the Rauschenberg Residency, the Fit Artist in Residence at Brown University, and a Creative Capital Grant. And she's here today to talk about Silk Poems, which debuted as an exhibition at the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art in 2016, and which was released as a book of poetry from Nightboat Books in 2017, and which Publishers Weekly calls one of her finest achievements to date. Terence Hayes says this of Silk Poems: read Jen Bervin's fascinating Silk Poems 100 times, and you will be given 100 gifts. This sensational book addresses both the past and the future, art and science, the earth and the stars. Everywhere Silk Poems is in incomparable conversation with us. And Mary Ruefle adds, Jen Bervin's work, all of it, engages the eye, the hand, the ear, and the mind. Her artistry is vast and inclusive by finesse and intelligence, by curiosity, forbearance, and vision. She knows the unexpected wonder of pattern is everywhere, and that the smallest detail contains enough energy to spawn a universe. I think they should send her into space, if it were not for the fact her work has already sent us there. Her poems in themselves, those exhilirated fragments, are the purest form of the art itself. They contain the innate inner gradients of whatever takes our breath away. Welcome to Between the Covers, Jen Bervin.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm so happy you're here. I would love to just start with the incredible origin story. Maybe we can. It feels like it really informs the reading of the book to sort of know how you came to it. So maybe we can start with how this became a project for you, and then how it evolved into what we have now.
Well, it became a project very casually. I would say it wasn't a project to begin with. It was just a question about what was happening at the Tufts University lab. Theo Amanetto and David Kaplan were working with liquefied silk. And what interested me about it was its biocompatibility. Silk is 100% biocompatible with our bodies. Any place in the body, it can be used optically. It can be nano-patterned. The instance that I was excited about when I visited the lab, I mean, they were working on a huge range of things and continue to. But the instance that really struck me was a nano-patterned optical silk biosensor, so made from liquefied silk. And they were developing it as something you could implant under the skin.
So by biocompatible, you mean that our bodies aren't going to reject it,
Exactly.
no matter where it's put.
Exactly.
But tell us a little bit what a biosensor is, and then perhaps you can also just explain what nanopatterning is also, so that people know why that would be intriguing to you as a writer.
Absolutely. So biosensors, I guess one of the sort of most recognizable form of a biosensor today would be like a Fitbit or something that's reading on the body and communicating technologically. The kind of biosensors that I encountered at Tufts were very, I want to say they're very simple. They weren't, but it was a nano pattern surface. So this is very, very small scale patterning, like something you'd see on the surface of a butterfly wing. The way that nano patterning was explained to me by Theo Amanetto was blue butterfly wing that looks blue, but structural blue, not pigmented blue, is a result of nano patterning on the surface. And if you were to drop a little bit of acetone on the wing of that blue butterfly, it would go clear in that place until the acetone dried. And in that way, the nano pattern surface makes it a sensor for acetone. So it reads acetone on the surface.
Okay.
The biosensor, the silk biosensor, works in a similar way. It's made from liquefied silk, nano patterned.
And how did you make the leap conceptually or inspirationally from nano patterning to poetry? Like, how did that occur to you in the process of going there with this open question about silk in this new medical arena?
Well, it came from the context of the sensor. So when I saw the prototype in Theo's office, because of the way it's patterned, you can project through it with fiber optic light and actually read an image with light on the wall. So I could see what was on the sensor, not with the naked eye, but by projecting it. And I saw the Tufts logo and various forms of clip art, and I thought, well, as a proof of concept, it's perfectly reasonable. But when I was thinking about what that sensor was being developed to do, which was to go under the skin and be a kind of a visual monitor through the skin for blood levels or blood sugar or something that would be read daily, it really gave me pause. I thought that's a really significant reading space. It's a significant space of imagination, and a person who's monitoring their health that closely needs a lot of things aside from just monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the sort of thing that poetry and art can respond to very agilely and in a very interdisciplinary, fluid way. And so the idea to write the poem in the biosensor really came from wanting to insert a form of care and a depth of attention to the material, to cultural context of silk and health. And
I love that the poem is addressed to the person who has the poem inside of them, and that the speaker of the poem is the silkworm. I think that is so beautiful. And I just wanted to ask you about if you felt like the silkworm had particular insights around mortality.
Massive insights. I mean, silkworms' life cycles are pretty short, 30 days roughly. And they go through, within that life cycle, they go through a lot of transformation, like 5 instars or kind of cycles of gorging themselves on leaves, pause or diapause, which I refer to as sleep sometimes in the poem. And then they wake up, they shed their last skin, and their new skin looks different each time. So it's their rate of transformation is really just astounding. And I felt like within their life cycle, they understand a lot of living and dying, and then they live and die a lot. And it's a culture that's been going 5,000 years.
Yeah.
So I started to think about the silkworm life cycle as 5,000 years rather than the 30-day.
Well, and if we think of the voice of the poem coming from the silkworm with this unique insight into mortality, it seems like, at least historically, you mentioned that the earliest human function of silk fabrics was wrapping children's bodies in tombs. And then I was just having a conversation with Forrest Gander and preparing for that conversation. One of his books talks about how in pueblos in Mexico, if a child dies, they'll put silk over his face or her face to believing that worms will recognize themselves and not then eat their face. But this connection to death seems like something that we've recognized around silk. Does that seem right to you?
Absolutely.
That it's not just imagining the silkworm perspective, but somehow we have connected silk in a way to the funereal rite in some fashion, historically.
Perfectly astute, as always.
Well, I wonder if we were to take that a step further, what are your thoughts on poetry with regards to death? I mean, on the one hand, it feels like people always lament it as a marginal art. And then on the other hand, it feels like even people who maybe are scared of poetry crave it to mark various important moments of their life. Do you feel like there's some sort of resonance between putting a poem in spoken by a silkworm versus a personal essay?
Well, I think you're exactly right. They are essential, and we realize how essential they are when life and living and dying gets to the space of the essential. So when someone's very ill, or when we have a really deep cultural moment that needs to be addressed, people always look to poems. They're always, seeking them out. Someone gets married, someone is born, someone dies.
Right. So it's not just death, but it somehow is marking the passing of time in some way.
Absolutely. Or the important occasions in our lives.
Yeah.
Or the sort of unspeakable occasions in our lives when we're just, deeply lonely or...
That's what I wonder, if it is something about the unspeakable, because language sort of might fail in capturing those moments, but poetry sort of allows the failure or the unspeakability in a way that maybe a narrative wouldn't.
Absolutely. I feel like it's at the edge of that.
Yeah. And is the Silk Poems Project in conversation with any history of poems in or on the body? Is there a tradition around that of... I wonder if pre-medically, if there's if there's any sort of implantedness of things or hidden poems in the history of this.
I mean, not necessarily poetry per se, but definitely the West African talisman and that art influenced how I thought about silk poems. This sort of secret text on the body, and even in form, in some ways, the deeply crenellated folds of a talismanic text hid inside of an object, they mirror the kind of folding in the beta sheet of the silk DNA. So I started to think about those in relation to each other.
Yeah. And if we think of this as a talisman, so this person who's ill is receiving a biosensor, which is hopefully going to monitor their health, but also receiving this poem written by a silkworm who's imparting wisdom to them. It's a layer of protection, and it's you've mentioned it as a carrier of a cultural history. You mentioned at the beginning here. So it's a tiny sensor, and you've also pointed out at the same time the Silk Road spanned a quarter of the equator. So can you talk to us a little bit about some of that cultural history that you hope is imbuing this talisman with a certain power that isn't simply the medical power? Absolutely.
I think that that space of monitoring can be a very lonely, very anxious space, and I think there's something unique to silk that it's so international. It has such longevity, and it, for me, it places in that context a sense of withness, that there's this very deep, very old, extremely nuanced history and culture that goes with this material, that accompanies this little tiny sensor under the skin. And that's all, the material, which is so simple, it's just protein and water, is a carrier for that culture. So I wanted the poem to share some of that. And because sericulture starts in China, I wanted the bulk of, or the sort of center of gravity of the cultural aspect of the poem to really stay there, read there, speak there, and think there. So,
before I sort of engaged with this project, of course, I thought of China. I think a lot of people would think of China. But the more that I looked at what you did, the more you really realize how much of it is outside of China also. Can you speak to some of the other influences or other places that you went? Like I discovered, for instance, in watching some of the videos, that the Caucasus Mountains were the site of making of silk for most of Europe. So even though China we think of as the source, it's the source in China, but not necessarily in other places.
Right. Everyone learns sericulture from China, but I think now the largest producers of silk are India, Brazil, and China. I visited 7 countries, 30 different sites, Turkey, Georgia in the Middle East, Italy and France in Europe, China, Japan, and then various sites throughout the U.S.
And when you say sites, we're talking a wide variety of types of places. So what would be like the two ends of that? So one I'm guessing would be places where silk is farmed, sericulture sites, right?
Right.
And then what would be something that would seem really different than going there?
I mean, well, I would start in places where I've researched before, like the Rati Textile Library at the Metropolitan Museum was a really good logical first place to start, because Rati is founded in Como, in Lake Como in Italy, which was a site for silk, primarily printing at this point. But I also needed to know how things like nanopatterning come to be, and so I visit, like the Stanford nanofabrication facility just to learn, to get up to speed. And then a lot of silk museums in China and Japan. They're so obvious if you grew up in those cultures, but as a person visiting from Brooklyn, I'd get questions like, "Don't you have silk museums in the U.S.?"
That's interesting.
I think especially, a lot of people I've talked to raise silkworms, as a class project, like the same way that, as a kid growing up in Iowa, we'd plant a pea seed in a milk carton.
Right.
It was just a thing that everybody did as part of their elementary school education. So most people have a very clear memory of that process.
So not only does the poem come from the voice of the silkworm, but you've said, and you mentioned this briefly about the beta sheet, which I'd like to lean into a little bit. You said that the properties of silk, or you wanted silk in its essence to inform the structure of the poem. So tell us the ways in which silk informs the structure of silk poems. And part of that might be just unpacking for us what some of the terminology is around the ways you've seen these microscopic, macroscopic resonances.
I'd love to. So at the DNA level, the building block of silk is just protein and water. And we're talking about, silk has 2 parts to it, the fibroin and the sericin. And when it's made in the body of the silkworm, it's coming out of the silkworm glands. So 2 little glands with fibroin are coming from either side of the body, and then in their spinneret, they combine with sericin, which is kind of like a gummy glue coating. And sericin is used in things like fish flakes or like fish food flakes. So you find it in some things you might have touched or seen in your life. And fibroin is usually separated out, or at least it is at Tufts, in this reverse engineered state. So going back to the gland the little silkworm. And I didn't know how I was going to write the poem. I didn't know what it would contain. I knew what I wanted to think about or ask or go in search of. But I mean, I knew almost nothing about what I would do before I did it. So I was really looking seriously to try to figure these things out. So like the DNA self-structures as a beta sheet, and that looks a lot like a weft thread in a weaving. When the so it snakes back and forth, or it can be likened to a form of writing called a bostrephodon, where you have alternating lines going left to right, right to left, in elegiac couplets in ancient Greece, when Greek and Phoenician were kind of mashing up as languages. So originally, when I first started, I thought I wanted to do something with the bostrephodon because it had this relationship to the beta sheet. And then I got a little further into the research and realized that the silkworm, when it writes its cocoon, is using this snaking back and forth pattern, this sort of like infinity-like looping, drawing, and that all silkworms do that. Yeah. And so you have this sort of collapse of scale between the tiny, tiny DNA beta sheet scale, the filament scale, and then the piece that I didn't really have until almost the exact window where I started writing the poem is that line, what I'd been imagining as a single line, was actually collapsing down to a strand of a 6-letter enjambed column of text. So that 6-letter enjambed part comes from the genome sequence. There's a 6-letter repeat in the genome that makes it very stable. And so I imagine the poem as a kind of a column, and then that column extruded out into this snaking silkworm filament shape. And I think that really came from an experience I had in Turkey at the Topkapi Palace of looking at Islamic manuscripts. And, when you look at the image of the manuscript, you have this collapse of scale from something that looks like a letter that's made of lots and lots and lots of letters, or something like a decorative border that's made up of finer and finer language. So, it's too. I'm sorry to be going in all sorts of different directions, but I feel like that's the kind of thinking that I needed to use in making the poem.
Yeah, and when you look at the pattern on the biosensor, it looks like the movements on the cocoon of the movement of the silkworm.
Yeah.
And you might not know unless you can magnify enough that thread you're seeing is actually the 6-letter columnar poem itself.
Exactly.
I love that.
So when it was on view at MassMocha, you could read the poem through the microscope. So you could move the stage of the microscope around on the XY axis and read at various points in the poem. So you could see letters. You could read. It's kind of hard to read in a 6-letter enjambed strand with no spaces. So you don't know where the words break and where the lines break. So,
well, I wanna go a little further into this mirroring of the microscopic and macroscopic, of the small and the large, because I see this in your other projects too, like perhaps most obviously the river, which is in a fixed relationship to the Mississippi River, and 1 inch of your river corresponds to 1 mile of the Mississippi River. Mm-hmm. And also that it took the same amount of time to sow each section of the river as it would to walk that section of the river. And you've talked about the river as the spine of the country, like the spine of a book. So we get all of this small and large, much like we do with the DNA, mimicking weaving, mimicking the movement of the silkworm. And it made me think of ideas that I think are shared in Western esoteric traditions and in Chinese mythology of as above, so below, or as in heaven, so on earth. For instance, I think like in Chinese acupuncture, a lot of the points have the same names as stars. And so if you were like doing pre-Maoist acupuncture, if you're doing it from the shamanic tradition, you would be seeing yourself regulating the celestial on the human body as the sort of like the map of the sky is the human also. So I guess I was just wondering what is attracting you to that relationship to scale that we see reoccur in your work?
That's such a beautiful reading of it. I don't know. I just love that zooming in and zooming out, and just how it makes the mind flex to do so. I recently had the opportunity at Northwestern to look at one of the sequins from the river in an electron microscope, so a SEM microscope, and it was this really wonderful experience of getting to see, this little tiny object, a single sequin that I've been sewing millions of, for I guess 12 years now total. At that scale, they look like little volcanoes, and they look geological, and also, I mean, in some ways, it for me, it got at the fundamental mystery of, what is this object? What is it made of? I don't know anything about this particular odd little sequin. It's foil stamped. It's backed with cloth. There are no other sequins like it that I've been able to find. So I had questions about how it was going to act in time. So I do have these questions about time and about scale that recur in multiple projects. So I learned that the sequin is mostly silver on its surface. But when you look at things through the SEM microscope, they're read by the periodic table of elements. So you can really see exactly which elements in the periodic table occur in your sample. And I learned that chlorine is deposited by the human hand. So I'm now thinking about touch differently.
Oh, wow.
It's like that's our trace. That's our human trace on an object. I wouldn't have known that before that.
This isn't really an issue around scale, but it is around this sort of harmony. When in one of the videos, when you're visiting a sericulture site, one of the farmers, I don't know if you call them farmers. Do you call them farmers? Yeah. He was talking about how they would take the silkworm feces and they would feed it to feed the sheep in the winter. And so, and then the sheep feces would fertilize the mulberry trees, which were the food source of the silkworm. So you get this self-consumption loop.
Exactly.
That feels really magical in a way. There's a magic to the system that they're using.
Yeah. Well, I think you start to think about shit differently when you realize it's just mulberry leaves coming out of the silkworm over and over. So they're making little mulberry leaf pellets that, of course, a sheep would want to eat. But that farm we visited was right on a kind of river-like canal, and Fisher was explaining to us that, maybe like 15 years prior, the shit from Shanghai would be coming down that river, and the fish would eat it. And that there was a much deeper, and sort of sustainable version of life cycles that.
And there's something, it's almost uncanny about the silkworm too, it seems like. From what I could gather, they can't survive on their own.
No.
They're completely linked into human society, essentially, that they eat only mulberry leaves. And that it was once believed that you had to feed leaves the same age of the worm itself as it was growing. That seems like, I mean, it almost feels like science fiction or fantasy in some way.
Well, if you think about when they're born, they're so tiny. It makes sense to serve the most tender leaves because they just don't, you have to cut them really fine. They don't have the physical capacity to eat a very tough old leaf at that point. So it makes perfect sense. But they're also very ecologically sensitive. Like when you're caring for silkworms, you can't wear perfumes or even like wash your hair with a shampoo that's quite smelly. It'll make them sick. Huh. So I do think that they could be potential harbingers for ecological disaster. That it might be that if we continue on our current path, we won't be able to continue to raise silkworms. They're pretty sensitive. They will read our destruction in their bodies.
Wow. Well, there are many ways in which I feel like we see the microcosm-macrocosm relationship in the actual book version of Silk Poems too, which opens with the epigram by Agnes Martin, "The wiggle of a worm as important as the assassination of a president." But one of the most striking ways we get the micro-macro in the book is visually. As we progress through the book, reading this long-form poem, there is something developing and elongating in the corner of each page, which isn't explained to us. At first, you might not notice it at all, but then at some point you realize that this looks like the design of a silkworm inscribing its cocoon. And I read that if you zoom in on this strand in the corner and enlarge it by 6,400%, you can read the text that makes up the strand. So tell us more about this growing silkworm strand, and whether this is the micropoem that we know about from the biosensor.
I wanted to draw a relationship between the sensor, the poem inscribed on the sensor, and the reading form of the poem in the book. And I wanted the book to necessarily be a unique instance of the work. So it's normal that I would work on any project in a range of iterations. And I'm not really a single work, kind of single image kind of thinker. So things splay out a little bit or take multiple forms. But in the book, I wanted it to be visually apparent, but not overbearing to the poem. This strand origin on the sensor. So I was trying to think about ways to convey that in a way that felt a little more embodied. And that tiny image on the recto corner of the page, for me, is an echo from a book that I find a little confounding by Bob Brown called Words, in which he has a tiny, 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 tiny sonnet on each of the poem pages, a different one than the one that you see on the page. And it's the kind of poem that you can miss even if you're looking for it. And I love that. I love that use of the page, of making things appear and reappear and disappear in plain sight. So I've been, that's been something I've been thinking about for some time. And with that tiny kind of like index image that you see in the corner of the page, that's showing you exactly where you are in the strand reading the poem. And if you had the PDF files for everyone, you could see that you are you have the information of the language that's on the following page. So it acts like a Shakespearean folio convention, where you have just the beginning half of a word printed at the bottom of the block of text to help the binder collate the text. So if the binder was, say, illiterate, they could then just look at that section of text and match it up with the next part.
That's really amazing. So tell us the considerations of bringing the poem outside of the body and having it appear in book form, not the microscopic poem, but the poem, the long form poem in couplets and small caps that we see, that is no longer a 6-character line. Yeah. What were you thinking of, and how did you arrive at the form that you arrived at, that we see as an object rather than inside?
Well, I always wanted people to be able to read the poem and read the poem with a little more ease than they could, say, through the microscope. Because even for me, I can hear the poem. It's still a struggle for me to read in that form. I wanted it to be encoded in the body, but then to be available to a reader. And in moving from one to the other, it was kind of a form of translation, in trying to think about how to make that leap in a way that communicated a lot of the ideas, but didn't but could do something else too. And so I started to think about what the poem was. It's a love poem from the silkworm to the person. So it's in couplets, and it's in all caps, which is kind of a reference to the genome sequencing and the way that looks. But when a silkworm eats through a leaf, it doesn't take a space between words. It just continues. So I wanted the line to be continuous and unbroken. I wanted it to look a little like the path of eating through a leaf or of a worm itself. So there's a resonance there. But the experience of reading in that form without any spaces between words really slows you down.
I love how the paper is so thin and semi-transparent too. It gives a real tactile experience to reading it.
I hear we're now getting our paper from Library of America.
Oh.
So it's the same paper they use.
Okay.
So sometimes it's called Bible paper, but
Well, before I wanna pivot to the voice of our silkworm poet, but before we do, I would love it if you would read the first two proverbs that we have before the poem begins.
absolutely. It is said that silk filature began in China under a mulberry tree in a teacup resting lightly in the slender hand of the empress, Si Ling Shi. A brin unfurls from the frisson tangle. She reaches in, begins to reel, filament from the soft envelope of the cocoon. That is how people like to tell it. You know the Nigerian proverb, until the lions have their own historians, history will always be told by the hunters. If you don't know it, why not?
We've been listening to Jen Bervin read from Silk Poems. I love how we get this human-centric proverb and then a proverb that suggests that a different story, a different history might emerge if we switched point of view. Because one of the great delights of this book is the voice and personality of this silkworm poet. She's funny and she's bold and super smart and learned. And she walks us through the life cycle of the silkworm and the pleasures the silkworm has each day. But she also quotes poets. She quotes C.D. Wright and Adrienne Rich, and ultimately makes the boldest claim, one that challenges us to consider this point of view switch in a deeper way. She argues that we shouldn't be surprised at all that a silkworm is quoting poetry because the silkworm invented language. And our silkworm poet makes a good argument for the history of silkworm language, maybe predating human language. So you mentioned, or the silkworm mentions, that the oldest record of the I Ching was a silk manuscript found in a tomb. So there's this great, I think there's this really delightful imaginative journey we can take of imagining the silkworm wrote the I Ching, this book of divination, and left it for us. And then we get that the word Jing signifies the warp threads of textile, and that it's preceded by the radical for silk in Chinese, and that the hexagrams in the I Ching, the names of them, a lot of them, sort of mimic the life cycle of a silkworm. So there's this whole argument for this being a silkworm written book. But then also the way, I mean, we have the origins of language and the origins of silk being intertwined, but that the silk radical appears in all of these words: paper, textile, book, compose, edit, weave, arrange, write. And so the more the silkworm sort of spells this all out for us, the more you start to think, wow, maybe the silkworm is writing reality.
It's definitely a fanciful, speculative take on it. But once you start down that path, it actually doesn't, it seems almost inevitable that could be a fact. I mean, when thinking about the I Ching and the trigrams, I really started to imagine them as leaves, like either whole or eaten through. And then, when you think about the word Jing, which has the character for silk in it, it doesn't even seem far-fetched. At a certain point, it just seems like, well, of course there's silk in, there's silk through and through. There's silk in the ideas, in the language itself, and
well, even the silkworm mentions also oracle script. So one of the first the beginnings of language when we were reading oracular cracks within bones and turtle shells. And that script was called bird and worm script, which is interesting. I don't know. Do you know why it was called that?
I don't. I mean, the language, the characters were incised on tortoise shells or bones. And I mean, I started to, you go down this path and you start to think, well, how was it incised? Like, what was doing the incising? And when you come across a form of the language called bird and worm script, I think it's like, okay, it's the worm telling the bird what to do on the shell. Like, literally, it seems so obvious. Huh. So, like, oracle script seems to me, when I'm just playing around in my mind as a kind of a collaboration between three species.
Yeah, that's great.
Obviously, none of this is factual. So.
Right. No, but also wondrous at the same time. So I've never been to a silkworm farm, but the way you describe it also feels, in a way, like a switch in point of view. And what I mean is, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but these short-lived silkworms feel sort of like they're being treated like royalty. And the humans are the servants. So their waste is swept away as soon as it appears. Food is constantly being provided them, and then allowing them to do what they want to do most. So eat, have sex, and weave. So that in the end, the worm isn't a domesticated livestock, but instead the human is a domestic servant.
I would definitely agree with that.
Is that that's the vibe you get?
I mean,
at
yeah.
The farms?
Well,
I mean,
no. I mean, so I haven't visited that many sericulture farms, and I should really qualify that and say that sericulture has a very wide range of manifestations, and some of them are more like that, like the farm we visited. And some of them are very industrialized and pretty disgusting. So it's not just, that idealized version is true, but it's not universally true.
Sure.
And so,
but maybe at one point, thousands of years ago, it could have been the norm. Yeah.
But I do think there is something to the fact that it's a very sensitive creature, and it does require that level of sensitivity and caring for it. And just like I was struck when I was learning how sericulture worked in the sheer quantity of leaves, like just how, for 30 days you have to drop everything and just give over all of your time and energy to feed and care for these voracious creatures. I mean, to go in 30 days to some form of your body that's 10,000 times bigger, that's
wow.
That's pretty intense.
Yeah, that is intense. So I wanted to pivot to the English from the Chinese. So we have this discovery that the silk radical is involved in a lot of words that we would associate with composing and weaving. But also you explore in English this connection between the word text and the word textile. And in much of your body of work, you've explored this connection between language and weaving. At the beginning of an anthology that you appear in, edited by Francesca Capone, is a quote from Roland Barthes' book, The Pleasure of the Text. And I'm just going to read it for a second. So he says, "Text means tissue, but whereas hitherto we have always taken this tissue as a product, a ready-made veil behind which lies more or less hidden meaning, truth, we are now emphasizing in the tissue the generative idea that the text is made, is worked out in a perpetual interweaving. Lost in this tissue, this texture, the subject unmakes himself like a spider dissolving in the constructive secretions of its web." And similarly, when you were discussing why you started weaving, you said you did so to find new terms in the vocabulary of tactile language. And when I think of your phrase, tactile language, and Bart's phrase, text means tissue, I think of language that is embodied or corporeal. And in your case, with silk poems, literally in the tissue. So we have the actual figure, both the figurative and the literal. But tell us in your own words, what is it that compels you around this text textile, tissue, tactile set of associative iterations.
So the phrase tactile language comes from Annie Albers, mid-century weaver, printmaker, artist, coming out of the Bauhaus and then teaching at Black Mountain College. And her book on weaving is hugely influential to me and to a lot of other artists and writers I know. So I wanted to credit her voice. I feel such a strong connection to textile thinking and tradition. I feel like for me, what is often referred to as craft ties into some very, very deep cultural knowledge, and often one associated with women's knowledge. And I like how there's an approachability in a work of art when it takes a textile form that's on some level like pre-thought. It's on the edge of knowing, speaking, reacting, and I think that really comes from that deep knowledge, and I like having some of that present and operative in the work when it's appropriate. For me, that sort of embodied knowledge of touching while thinking is very primal. I mean, I remember being a very, very young girl and just rubbing the edge of a blanket, sort of silken, satiny edge of a blanket. And that sort of movement of my hands across the cloth was a way to just think. It was like walking. It was a way to move thought. And to me, those things have always worked together.
And I would imagine a different sort of thought might happen if you're attending to perception and to tactile phenomenon.
I would hope so. It's hard. Sometimes it's hard to get outside of your own experience and imagine how to translate how you think and perceive and feel and put things together for other people. I mean, I try to evidence that in the work, but I'm not sure I'm the best narrator of how I think because I'm inside of it.
Yeah.
So I try to.
But one thing that is interesting, you've spoken a lot about time, and there's a lot of time that passes in the creation of your projects. Mm-hmm. But you also talked about how with the silk poems, you didn't know what you were doing. So like when you talked about pre-thought that happens with these tactile activities, it seems like you're taking a similar approach, perhaps, that you're not allowing the mind. I mean, there's the questions that are happening. I don't know if I'm phrasing this right, but that you're sort of forcing yourself to stay in not knowing rather than knowing, so something can emerge from that. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think of it as a kind of a space for coming to know.
Yeah. That you didn't go to the Silk Lab with a full-on agenda.
No. I usually go to a lab with full-on questions.
Right.
And then I won't know till quite a bit later what parts of the experience will move forward in time or how. Or I just trust that they'll be meaningful, useful, that I'll learn something. And that's enough for that day.
Right. I know this might be a stretch, but you quoted Toni Morrison for your River project, and it feels important somehow how she connects memory and imagination to the body, even though that's not the topic of what she's saying. It sort of feels like it is, and I wanted to read it and just hear your thoughts in that light. So she says, they straightened out the Mississippi River in places to make room for houses and livable acreage. Occasionally, the river floods these places. Quote unquote, floods is the word they use, but in fact, it is not flooding. It is remembering where it used to be. All water has a perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it was. writers are like that, remembering where we were, that valley we ran through, what the banks were like, the light that was there, and the route back to our original place. It is an emotional memory, what the nerves and the skin remember, as well as how it appeared. And a rush of imagination is our flooding. Such an amazing quote. But the way she says it's an emotional memory and immediately goes to the words nerves and skin makes me think of this idea of it's not an ignoring of the mind, but it's placing the mind in a different relationship to perception, to touch, to the bodily experience of being in place. Does that resonate at all with some of what you're...
Absolutely. I want to acknowledge the filmmaker Natalia Almada, who uses that part of that quote in her first film, and who's the one who shared that with me. I went to a talk last week by Jason Moran, and he was talking about, he's a pianist, jazz pianist, and one of the great American artists in my mind. And he was talking about getting the left hand to know. And he used this gesture where he slid his right hand under his left hand and lifted his left hand up to demonstrate that knowing. And I think all musicians have that kind of embodied knowledge. But I was so struck in that moment by how he represented it, of like how literally like it's getting like the knowledge inside the hand, under the hand, lifting the hand up. And when I hear the Toni Morrison quote about in the nerves, and I think about how your body has to know something for you to be able to really utilize that knowledge. But I think there are a lot of different directions you can think in that quote, which is, it's so typical of Toni Morrison's work. And
yeah, she's amazing.
She's really such a great... But I use that quote in relation to the river because I wanted that piece to really contain a lot of kinds of knowing. And now that I'm getting ready to present it for the first time in October at the Des Moines Arts Center, I've been thinking again about how to bring lots of kinds of knowing, lots of kinds of knowledge, lots of different stories about the river, perspectives on the river into the publication for that show. And so that's been really fun to open it back up. It's almost like an inverted Silk Poems where all the research is happening at the end.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking today to Jen Bervin about her latest book from Nightboat Books, Silk Poems. So I was hoping maybe you'd read a longer section of the book, if you didn't mind.
I'd love to. Just below my mouth, my spinneret works 9 or 10 inches in the first minute. 65 elliptical motions. My head is spinning. The brin issues in a glutinous state, hardens into lines, becomes structure. With strength, length, and luster, the fibroin strands emerge prismatic. 2 triangular tubes glued in Saracen. When light shines through a prism, it breaks into 7 colors, a continuous spectrum with infinite possibilities. With elasticity, affinity, and the right mindset, all ways are easy. Once I start weaving, I can't hear. A practice is not a thing in itself. It is a way to be happy and calm in life. I write it side to side, infinity loops, figure 8 spins, as much as 6 miles, 60 hours, 3 days. Sure, I count. I modulate it, slow it down, elongate the loop, concentrate on the line. I try not to have ideas because they're inaccurate. Instead, I try to think of the words I want to spend time with. Beta sheet, bostrephodon, weaving a weft thread, an elegiac couplet, an epitaph carved in alternating directions. To reverse the reverse becomes the work, to separate your right brain from your left and build back up, to remove specific outcomes and truly create something new. Even that word looks old. Silk, language, mediums infinitely larger than any intention. This little silk in me, polymath, string figure, present. small wild things that shine obstinately. Hold the body free from harm, cloth, tissue, body, issue. Here is this thing I made of myself with others alive in you. I give you my silk cocoon, this flying garment for the soul. I've drawn infinity into it.
We've been listening to Jen Bervin read from the Silk Poems. I love that line here, or those lines. Here is this thing I made of myself with others alive in you, which on the most literal level is the silk biosensor, but it also feels like it's describing the act of writing and reading in a way, like the way that something that you've done finds its life in someone else.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's also practical. Like a silkworm doesn't do much alone. It does it with other silkworms.
Yeah. And I wanted to maybe travel down that rabbit hole because one of the things it implies is that this thing that I make of myself when I write is inevitably with others too, not just the silkworms. It's a conversation with our contemporaries and with the writers that have shaped us. And you've borrowed and woven the lines of other people throughout this book. So part of what we just heard included the words of Diana Frid, Agnes Martin, and Cecilia Vicuña. And in other places we get Emily Dickinson, Rosemary Waldrop, and others. Is this a nod to sort of the way we write among other people or out of what other people have written?
Oh, absolutely. And it's a nod, too, to the scientists who helped inform the poem. Fiamma Neto is quoted in that section where he's talking about separating your right brain from your left and builds back up to separate out. If you want new outcomes, you have to loosen that thinking in order to get to them. I love that material scientists have the ability to do that. I think it's very, very difficult to do as an artist. So I aspire to it. I don't think I'm there yet, but...
Well, there's also this idea of suspending one's tendency towards knowing the outcome before you've started. I think that's also perhaps an idealized version of science, too. I don't think all science is happening that way, but in the ideal form, you would think that without any pressures, the scientist would be inquiring, kind of the way you're describing your arrival in all of these places with questions more than with plans.
I would hope.
Well, one of the things we haven't discussed yet in depth is gender, and you did mention a little bit earlier, but it feels like it's a central element to most of your projects, particularly the ones that engage with weaving and interweaving. It doesn't feel like a coincidence that most of these voices that are woven into silk poems are women, or that the silkworm poet herself is a woman. And I wonder about weaving in relationship to writing in the sense that women were prohibited from engaging with language and religion or in other ways for thousands of years. And in a way, when we think about the silkworm asserting that it's the beginning of language, I wonder if women in weaving and sewing, if that's sort of what you're asserting also. As a way that they took and made their own.
Yeah, I think a lot about forms of female excellence and historically channels that were open to women. So absolutely. I don't think of the silkworm narrator as female necessarily.
Oh, you don't?
No. It's fun to hear you call the silkworm she. Because it's first person, you don't have to specify.
Okay.
I definitely think it's a very queer poem, and it was nominated for a Lambda, which made me really, really, really happy to be on that list.
Well, I also thought of how what gets foregrounded is in the silkworm cycle is giving birth, weaving and sewing, in a sense, and then we think of the women who are making these objects out of the silk. So there's this sort of, again, a micro macro level around this, which feels very, very gendered.
Absolutely. You find men and women throughout textile histories. But it is one of the forms in which women can excel. And one excellent artist I've been looking at very closely is the Chinese poet Su Wei, a 4th century Chinese poet who wrote a poem with 8,000 possible readings that was either embroidered or woven in the form of a textile in 5 colors. And the form of that poem draws from an astronomical gauge called the armillary sphere. So
Well, I actually want to go in depth on this project. But before we do, I'd like to step back and ask about this distinction between art and craft, and whether you believe it has any validity, or whether you feel like the fact that, say, Su Wei's poem might be considered a craft, or that other art forms by women, or even not just women, but also, say, indigenous cultures, are shunted into the category of craft. If there is erasure happening in that, in terms of we don't have to engage with them with a certain level of seriousness because they're there, versus if they were considered art, or is there a valuable distinction between the two in your mind?
I think you have to raise an eyebrow anytime someone's starting to draw distinctions of category, because there's always a politic behind those distinctions. I mean, even with my own work, I find that when people are drawing distinctions of category, that they're usually doing it to exclude me from something. And that they're always motivated. So rather than asking the validity of the category, I like to ask the validity of the motivations. And often the motivations around distinctions of craft have to do with either industrializing forms of making, and therefore sort of fetishizing the handmade, or they have to do with excluding work that has that kind of knowledge from what they're trying to frame as a dominant discourse. And I think it's particularly harmful in art making. I think that those categories are really, in the same way that poetry has become incredibly varied and hybrid, I think you have incredibly varied and hybrid forms of art and craft making and thinking now. But when craft is edited out, the motivations for that are often completely political. They're very gendered, and they're cultural. I mean, if you think about why you would draw distinctions between art and craft thinking and making, it excludes most women. It excludes most of the world. It excludes most of what's been made through time, and it leaves you with a lot of 20th century paintings, which are made by who?
Right.
Whom?
Well, this may not be exactly the same, but I know you're uneasy with the term erasure being applied to you. I don't know that it's being used to erase your work, but as we're talking about this cultural erasure that's happening with this art and craft distinction, it's interesting that you're called an erasure poet, or that you do erasure poetry, because a lot of your work feels like it's the opposite to me. It feels like you're actually foregrounding the erased. So like the variant marks of Emily Dickinson, or erased art forms of women in Silk poems and a whole bunch of other projects of yours. But I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about that term in relationship to your work.
I would say that a lot of the work that I'm doing is either intratextual or contextual, and to use the term erasure is a little misleading for that. I understand that that's the way in which works like Nets are typically referred to and framed, and sometimes I'll cite the term myself, but I don't really think that that's the spirit of what I'm trying to do.
And to be fair, even with Nets, you can read the Shakespeare.
Yeah.
So there's some erasure where it's truly you can't read it, but we're getting a layering. It made me think of a conversation, part of the conversation with Forrest Gander. We were talking about how people had described some of his poems in his new collection as being accretions, which is a geologic term. He used to study geology and this layer of sedimentation. And it feels in a way like you're playing with these layers. Yeah. Which layer is going to be more legible than the other, but they're all legible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
I think that's 100% true. And I do feel like one of the reasons I love to work that way is because it, by drawing reference to other writers, you say, I'm not alone here. I'm not the first to do this. I'm part of a larger conversation, which has a dominant discourse. I mean, that was the point in working with the Shakespearean sonnets. But it was also in some ways, I was at a point of desperation of just trying to get my point across to writers that I understood their language, but I wasn't going to speak it that way.
Yeah.
That I was going to do it differently.
Yeah.
And I couldn't think of anything more evident or like agreeable than Shakespeare. No one would contest that was poetry, even though they were contesting or having a harder time coming to terms with what I was presenting.
Yeah. Do you feel like there's an erasure gender component in the sense, is it coincidence that with the Shakespeare, with Nets and with the Desert, which are both engagements with the work of men, the writing of the men gets put in the background and your intervention gets brought to the foreground? And in the Dickinson projects, you're doing a sort of mending and sort of archaeology of bringing forth the things that probably in a lot of cases men had erased in her work and brought them to the front.
Well, men and women. I mean, I think
That's true.
She had a lot of female editors. They don't get
they don't get a pass.
They don't get a pass, and they also don't get as much credit as they deserve. Even the editorial histories of Dickinson are very gendered. I think there are some really, really interesting early works on Dickinson by the female editors. Bianchi, in particular, I think is excellent, and I still use her work. But yeah, you're absolutely right that I'm trying to surface some things and kind of quiet
other things.
And it's not that I feel that should be the cosmic balance. It's the cosmic rebalancing that needs to happen.
Yeah.
So and there are many contexts in which I need to be quieter and listen. And I think that as writers, thinkers, readers, artists, makers, we have to be sensitive to.
So as part of your 7 years of research around the globe at textile archives, biomedical labs, sericulture farms, you encountered some other interesting things. A lab that is developing silk skin replacement, and then more recently an engineer who's using kirigami, the Japanese art of paper cutting, to help design silicon wireless transmitters. But the encounter that captivated you the most was one that you mentioned earlier, and it's this project with Sue Wei's reversible poem, written and embroidered by her in the 4th century in China. So we get this intersection of weaving and poetry again, and it's one of the first, if not the first, poems by a woman that we have.
I think it's. Well, it's one of the earliest ones I know of, 4th century, but it's also one of the first in its form, this reversible poetry form. And it's a form that's uniquely and perfectly adapted to Mandarin, in that you have a visual character that contains a word rather than just a single letter. So it allows you to read in that kind of a structure in a way that we can't really do in English.
Well, tell us more about why this is your next project, and it's attracted you to do a sustained engagement with it, and it makes me the fact that you can read this poem in thousands of ways makes me think a little bit of Dickinson's variant Marx, but also makes me wonder, like, this is such an incredible poem on so many different levels. It again makes me wonder, why did nobody talk about it? So why is it so recent that we're reconsidering this poem? At least that's what it feels like. So tell us a little bit both about what is attracting you to engage with it, and what are your theories on why this poem has been a quiet poem, even probably among the Chinese themselves.
I think that questions of gender are prominent in what's considered a classic and what's not. And thankfully, there's a lot of scholarship by women that kept Su Wei's poem alive. Either painters recopying her poem on scrolls, or like the first female empress of China, Wu Zedong, writing an account of the poem. Histories of Jin Dynasty, etc. That thankfully we have what we have on that poem largely through the scholarship of women, and yet it has this status that is, to me, just mystifying. I mean, I can't imagine anything more qualifying to be seen as excellent and enduring and essential to a cultural canon, really. So I think that the sort of the deficit of that attention was in part what drew me, but I would say that the overwhelming sense of wonder about what that work is and what it does and how it came to be and what it means and how it could be read and how it's understood today.
I mean, you have the text and textile.
Right.
You have the erased history of a female artist. You have the astronomical gauge. So we have
art and science.
So we have art and science, and also as above, so below with the stars, and also that this is a poem. It's also a love poem in a sense too.
Right.
And then you embarked on a translation of it at one point.
Oh God, yeah, what a disaster.
Well, that's what I was wondering. Like, how did you come to think that? I know other people, I think, are translating it.
Yep.
At some, is that true?
Yeah, there's a quadrant of the poem David Hinton has translated kind of cartographically in a way.
Yeah. I just can't think of a poem that seems less translatable.
It's as difficult a translation problem as you could possibly come across. And it's not just that. I think that what I've come to understand is that the issues of translating that poem are not just translation-based issues. They're temporal issues. It's that we don't have the cultural understanding that we need to have to understand how to read a reversible poem from the 4th century. Even classical Chinese scholars are confounded by it. So I would say that, as Wen Jin, one of the scholars we interviewed, says, it's equally confounding to all people, no matter what their level of expertise is.
Well, what's interesting about this, when we think about you're starting from a place of questions, which is inevitably going to lead to some false starts or some dead ends as part of the process. And you have this impulse to think maybe the way to go with this is to translate it, and then realize that's not the way to go. Or maybe that the idea of translation needs to be redefined. And so you've come up with a way to redefine how to translate this poem, involving others, kind of like that line that we ended with in the Silk poem reading. Tell us a little bit about how you've landed on engagement with the poem as a project.
So to put a little pressure on the translation failures of my own, so I was trying to translate the version of Su Wei's poem that I had from simplified characters. So I was just essentially mapping out character by character all the possible meanings for that character, and then all of the possible meanings for that character in relation to the characters next to it. So if you were reading from the diagonal to the right, or if you're reading from the diagonal below it to the left, or, et cetera, and then I realized when I was about, 50 pages of notes in, that I was just, not only did I not have the right version of the poem at that point, if there is a right version, but I also was working from the wrong character set. I was working from simplified. The original was in classical. You lose a lot of layers of meaning going from classical to simplified characters. And it wasn't until I was a lot further into the research that I was able to pinpoint all the different versions of the poem itself. So there's no original. It was lost around the 12th century. So we have a lot of accounts of the poem. We have a lot of recopied versions of the poem, but they're wildly different from one to the next. You know, like they might be like 50, 60% different in placement or character. So this question of like, can it be translated gets really complicated at the outset, because you have that question of the missing original, which a lot of translations have. But
we think of like Anne Carson with Sappho, and the way she deals with it, with the marks on the page to show where we don't have the words for each of those poems.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that book. But with Dickinson, we have manuscripts. We have originals to point to that we seemingly don't point to enough. But what I came to realize really with translation issues around Su Wei's poem were so difficult and so, attenuated that it wasn't going to be solved by one completely inexperienced translator or even, a whole host of really experienced translators. It would just, it needs a lot of attention through time from very different perspectives. And so I really started to think, okay, this is definitely not research for silk poems. This is like, just blew the circuits for that. Mm-hmm. It's going to be its own work. And so at that point, after, 2 months of failure in Italy, trying to work on this translation, was happily defeated and saved it for later. And then 2013, I think, picked it up in collaboration with my partner, Charlotte Lagarde, who's a documentary filmmaker. And we worked together with Violet Dufang in Shanghai. She produced the project and was instrumental in drawing all kinds of connections on the ground in Shanghai. We were there about 3 months of last year in sum, and we approached Su Wei's poem from a number of different perspectives. First, from the textile. So getting at this question of the missing original and of thinking about reading the poem in its kind of infinite possibility. We were drawing connections between textile-based time and making and thinking, and what it would take to make a poem like this, not just to write one, but to make it. And we commissioned a Suzhou embroiderer to remake the 840 version and the 841 version of the poem. And we filmed the embroidery process, which is a reversible silk embroidery, from underneath. And so we have hours and hours and days of real-time footage of the embroidery process. So you have a character coming into being from the underside. So you're seeing the side that the embroiderer is making perfectly, but can only feel.
And you have that perspective with the river project too. You're seeing the river as if you were looking from within the earth up rather than down. So similar to this reversal of point of view in silk poems. Yeah.
I love the impossible perspective, the inside perspective. Yeah. With the Su Wei's poem, we're drawing a relationship between firmament or cosmos and poem, and also time in making and thinking and reading a poem.
And you've also been engaging various Chinese women in conversations around the poem of very different backgrounds. Can you talk a little bit about that too?
Yeah, absolutely. So we did a lot of interviews, and as someone who works in multiple fields, I'm sometimes frustrated with the limitations of a field. I draw a lot upon the expertise of one, but especially around literature, it feels so limiting sometimes, the ways in which we are willing to think through a particular person's work. Those frameworks can be so strong and so rigid at the same time.
That's a good way to put it.
And so we we wanted to get a lot of contemporary perspectives on Sue's poem, and not necessarily expert perspectives, but just ones that would think or flex or move differently around it. And as Westerners, Charlotte's French American, I'm American. It wasn't really our story to tell. I mean, I think it's great to ask questions and to spend deep, deep time with work, but who narrates the poem? I don't feel like it should be me, and it shouldn't be Charlotte. But I do feel like we can, give a frame or give a voice to other perspectives. And we were very, very, very lucky to work with Violet Dufang because she found just such excellent people to weigh in on the poem.
And the fact that you have, say, like an astrophysicist and a professor of comparative literature and a master weaver, it reminded me a little of a Sophie Calle exhibition in Paris where she had been broken up by someone and she gave the letter to like an opera singer and a lawyer and a psychologist, and they all did their own thing. So one person sang it, another person analyzed it, another person did a legal brief. It's really wonderful, this sort of gathering around.
A number of people have drawn that comparison.
Oh, they have?
I really like it.
Yeah.
I think that's
it was at the Bibliothèque Nationale too.
Yeah. Excellent work. But I'm very grateful to the interviews because I've learned so much about the poem, and not in a way that I could learn, for example. Like Yulan's interview, she's the algorithmic game theorist. She broke down her perspectives into 5 different structured categories based on complexity theory, based on analytic geometry, cryptography. They're things that I might think near but never think that way. Mm-hmm. And I'm so grateful that her mind and her way of reading through Su Wei are framing the conversation. It's kind of beyond my wildest dreams
That's amazing. So is that what we're going to expect from you next after Silk Poems? Is this project with Su Wei's reversible poem?
Yeah, that's underway, and so Charlotte and I are still thinking through the presentation of that work and how we're thinking of a multi-channel installation for that work, and we're trying to really situate the experience in a meaningful way. And one of the challenges of work like that is how to invite a viewer, audience member in ways that create ample time. Because often in an exhibition, you feel like you want to float through or move through, and how to create the conditions where someone really wants to linger and listen and move from kind of point to point.
Did people tell you what Sophie Calle did for that exhibition? Because you're in this really old library space. It's really beautiful, and you can walk around and see things on the wall. But then there were probably 100 or 200 places where you could sit with headphones and watch things that had been made on video or audio by different people engaging with the letter, including animals. Like there was a parrot that tears the letter into pieces in a very specific way. But you could sit all alone or you could wander, and there was no prescribed way to move.
Oh, I love that.
Either. So you could spend your time in one little corner too. It was interesting. I never thought about that around time.
That's interesting. I've only heard about the piece and read about it. I've never experienced it.
Yeah.
I think we need to. Maybe that's the next point of research.
Yeah.
But that work is next, and I'm also working on some new pieces related to SETI, my artist in residence with SETI Institute, which stands for Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence.
Oh, no way.
So they have a lot of affiliations with NASA, Ames, and scientists all over the world. I mean, when you hear the term, most people laugh, but I mean, most things I do, most people would laugh, like lesbian poetry. Come on.
And silkworms, they almost seem extraterrestrial. They seem like they came from another planet.
They are.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm collaborating with an Australian artist, Faye Devi, and we're thinking in a number of different directions. I'm going to Tasmania and Australia in May.
Wow.
To work with her. I've been thinking a lot about meteorites and Chinese literati, objects of contemplation, in particular stone sculptures, and ways in which we understand the cosmos through an object.
That sounds amazing. Hopefully, I'm hoping, I'm going to put out the hope that in a couple years you're back here talking about meteorites with me.
I would love that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for being on the show today, Jen.
Thank you for having me.
So we're talking today to Jen Bervin about her latest book from Nightboat Books, Silk Poems. So you've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the studios of KBOO. Volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength community radio from Portland, Oregon, found at kboo.fm. More of Jen Bervin's work can be found at jenbervin.com, as well as patreon.com/betweenthecovers, where we discuss the importance of Paul Celan's work to her aesthetic, where she reads some of Paul Celan's prose and his poetry, and then a poem of hers. Finally, I'd like to thank Imre Lodbrog and Barbara Browning for creating this outro. Their album, Imre Lodbrog, A Sapatita Me, can be found at iTunes, and Barbara Browning's trove of ukulele covers can be found at soundcloud.com/Barbara Browning.